This meeting is being recorded.
As if you couldn't believe it the first time, the second time should tell you. You are watching or listening to another edition of Forward Maryland. Today is Sunday, March 20th, 2022. I'm Bill Woodcock.
And I'm Steve Hunt. Happy Sunday, everybody.
And Steve, I'm trying to change my perspective. I'm using an alternative camera angle today so that it doesn't always look like I'm looking down or that I'm looking around. I'm told that a lot of times it looks like I'm looking around. How do I look to you today, Steve?
Looking good, brother. Looking good, and not necessarily tan, rested, and ready, but I'm sure ready to rock and roll with our guest today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Truthfully, a face made for radio. Thank you for that compliment, kind sir. So today, we go back to kind of the roots of Forward Maryland, and we bring back today a old friend of the podcast. In fact, she came to us a couple of years ago. Jason and I had interviewed her when she was a candidate for the Baltimore City Council, and I've known Natasha Guynes a little bit longer than that. And she's also in her real life or non-political life, or maybe it all kind of merges. We're going to talk about that. She is the founder and president of her Resiliency Center, which is a nonprofit organization she formed to aid young women who are caught up in the throes of addiction, substance abuse, homelessness, and also who are victims of sexual exploitation. So Natasha, it is with pleasure that we welcome you back to the show today. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
So
I have one life.
It is our pleasure. And as I said, back in the beginnings of Forward Maryland, we wanted to talk not just about politics, but about people who are in this area, who are in this region, I should say, who are making a difference. And you are certainly doing that. And as you and I both know, the face of recovery has no one face. It has a multitude of faces. Tell us, as we are in, a third of the way almost into 2022 and coming out of the, let's hope, the backside of the COVID pandemic, tell us what you see as maybe the 2 or 3 major issues in the recovery community.
Well, I just have to say, we were talking about like my non-political or my real life, and Bill, I think you've heard this, that I don't have a personal life or a professional life. I have a life, and it's because at her Resiliency Center, we're really building a community of women supporting women. And of course, it takes some men to be a part of our community as well, to help strengthen the advocacy for women and the needs of women. Prior to the pandemic, though, to answer your question, prior to the pandemic, if you didn't have anything then, you don't have anything now. And I think that is a lot of like from an economic perspective, and also the desperations that went along with not having anything before, then even being in more desperate positions throughout the last 2 years. We know that there have been a number more of overdoses as people haven't had other options for mental health recovery or access to therapeutic services. At her, what we saw the most emerging in late 2021 and still now is the lack of connection that the women we serve have to natural supports that they would have had prior to the pandemic, and then adding on any kind of therapeutic supports.
So the question that I asked you, and I hate to say this, but for the first question I asked you a question that I was suspecting that would be the answer of, because I know that here in Central Maryland, which sometimes we call the land of milk and honey, we don't really think about people who are in recovery. And we think that, that folks in recovery are someone else's problem. But I mean, I happen to be familiar with you, with your work, and you are literally on call 24/7 to help women who are going through some sort of a crisis situation in their lives, be it addiction-based, substance-based, or also somebody who's been victimized by somebody who's taking advantage of them intimately. You know, what are the, you know, what are the strongest challenges that that you find in terms of trying to find support for people who don't have natural advocates? You know, you and I had a conversation one time, and we talked about the fact that the recovery community does not have a lobby. People in recovery are not thinking of going to Annapolis or DC and lobbying. You know, what do you see as the things are that people in the community most desperately need?
Sure. Bill, if you would, and see if you guys wouldn't mind me just stepping back for a moment and sharing a little bit what we do at HER and who we see come through in a little bit of a different lens. So at HER Resiliency Center, we support young women 18 to 25 overcoming various forms of hardship. So we only ask that they identify as female and be in that age range. And we started in Washington, D.C. We expanded to Baltimore in 2019. I know, Bill, you talked about like the podcast being more central Maryland, and people may not be as familiar with Baltimore City or the D.C., what we see in those two areas. But I will tell you, there's a lot of individuals who need support that are often hidden in plain sight. When I was running for office, like you said, as a council candidate, and the pandemic had just started to shut things down, I was having a hard time keeping some staff because the work we do is in person. It's not something that can be done from behind a desk. And even myself, as like you mentioned, the executive, the founder and president of the organization, I make calls that are to respond to certain needs that are more, especially those that are more high level. But during the pandemic, I was doing street outreach, and someone said to me, someone in Maryland politics said to me, "You're not being safe." And they were kind of criticizing me because I was out doing street outreach during a pandemic. And in that same conversation, they segued to think about how many people walked by you and didn't say anything when you were out there. And what that means is that, you know, when I was 20, I was selling my body, smoking a crack pipe and drinking alcoholically at some bars in Washington, D.C. And how many people walked by me not thinking I would be where I am today? And so that went full circle to be able to say, and that's why street outreach doesn't stop in a pandemic. We walk by women, we walk by people who need help every day. But for us at HER Resiliency Center supporting women, we walk by them and we think, yeah, they're okay, or not my problem, or they've chosen this life, when there's really, you know, if someone isn't informed of what their options are and how to access them, their options don't exist. And so that is a lot of what we do, is helping them understand their options.
So for people who don't know about a HER Resiliency Center, what are their typical options?
Without access, you know, I recently wrote an op-ed on regarding violent Johns and sex traffickers, and in this conversation around the decriminalization or the legalization around sex work. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not someone who is a proponent of criminalizing women. I spend way too much time in a courtroom trying to support her not to have previous charges, to want that for her life. That said, it's I wrote this op-ed and I used, you know, examples of women getting locked in basements by Johns, women who are on the streets, and especially in Baltimore, seeing other women murdered, other sex workers murdered. And those aren't victimless crimes. And in that conversation, with this op-ed, someone responded, 3 other lawyers responded, and they said, like, People who are arrested for sex work, who are really being sex trafficked, often don't disclose the first time that they were being sex trafficked. Well, no shit. Sorry. They don't oftentimes those we serve who are sex trafficked don't know they're being trafficked. The legal definition is force, fraud, or coercion. And that coercion, especially when your boyfriend is trafficking you, you don't know, like, why would he loves me? Of course he's here for me. But we had, on the flip side, someone who loves you doesn't ask you to go sell your body to other men. And that is like something without a Resiliency Center stepping in, asking those kinds of questions like, hey, I have to ask so many questions. Do you get to keep your money? Do you have to share your money? Where does your money go? Do you have enough to eat? Can you leave? Like, the layering of questions is pretty deep before we can even get to a place where I can see a light in her eyes. And then there's the mental trauma bonding, which is more dangerous than any of the physical change you could put on her. And there's also just, if she is a sex worker with consent, it's like, does she want a different choice? Because again, if we don't know our choices, can't really access them. And then if there's substance use involved, that first taking advantage of another choice often starts with substance use recovery. Steve.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that, just as we're on the subject of trafficking, and you talked about, Central Maryland with respect to DC and Baltimore, but one thing we do see in Central Maryland is, we over the years, had become a hub for sex trafficking, because of the fact that, say, Howard County, where Bill and I are, I-95 runs through Howard County. Route 1 runs through Howard County. These are main arteries where trafficking happens. And in our county, to their credit, our local police department has done a really good job of doing various sting operations. Their approach is to try to go after the Johns, those who are procuring sex, and hoping that basically eliminating demand will do something about supply, because you're afraid to make that call if you're a potential John. So I guess my bigger question is that the right approach to combat this issue? And one thing I will also say, when there is a bust, that the county often, the police will try to refer the worker over to a crisis center or another organization like yourselves to try to provide that support to women who clearly are victims of this trade. So my question again is that the right approach that is being taken in Howard County, of having these sting operations to go after the demand as opposed to supply? And beyond that, what else could be done to combat this problem?
I'm sorry, make it. So there will be some advocates in the arena that'll say, like, by decreasing demand will cause more violence in these other places, and we're not going to be able to cut off all areas. I think the industry of sex trafficking makes a lot, like the illegal side of it makes a lot of money, and so does the social service side. There's a lot of money. So really cutting it off it's a very lucrative industry to be able to try to really stop it on both sides. I think one of the things is really just having law enforcement that's trained and understanding. A lot of times we have these notions that law enforcement think they understand, but I'll give an example. I do best with examples. A couple of weeks ago, I was called to BPD, where a woman called her Resiliency Center's phone line, and I took the call, and I thought, you know what, I can do this. She identified as having been sexually assaulted, and I responded, and I'm thinking, well, we don't do sexual assault response. I can call some of our preferred partnerships, and I can make a warm referral. And I get to BPD and I ask, like, the detective, hey, can you tell me what's happening? I didn't ask any questions. And the detective said, apparently she's been human trafficked. And that apparently was pretty dismissive in nature. And I asked the detective, can we contact the sex trafficking unit? And she just stared at me. And I started naming names of those who were in the unit previously that weren't there now. I was like, can you call them and ask them who replaced them? Just stone cold faces. And I go in, And I talked to the young woman, and she was gang trafficked for 8 years. 8 years. And gang trafficking is some of the most violent sex trafficking that exists. And she is, I call it our care, because it's not really services, because she needs a high level of intensive services. But, those detectives weren't prepared to engage with her. She had been sexually assaulted right before that by the trafficker's brother. And that didn't make sense to the police. Well, traffickers use tracking devices. They put them in the phones, they put them on their backpacks, they put them in their bodies. Think about your cat. If your cat runs away, or Bill, if Abby was to run away, like, you'd be able to find her. And that's what sex traffickers do, because those that they are trafficking are their cattle, and they want to find them. And so we need to have more individuals who actually in this arena who understand the difference between sex trafficking and sex work, to really make an impact, but also have less of a vested interest in, is it sex trafficking or sex work, but what is best for her.
So I'm wondering, and Steve put his finger right on the nail of where I was of my other questions. We like to think that these problems are city problems, right? They're Baltimore or DC problems. But with the availability of transportation, of highways, of hotels, where this sort of activity can go on, it's a regional problem. It's not confined to a city. And so how do you wind up making that connection that the conditions that people are suffering from are different? Because starting with O'Malley's administration in Maryland, you started to see everything that we are talking about: addiction, mental health, sex trafficking, thrown under the umbrella of behavioral health, which is a wonderful term, but it is not a one-size-fits-all term. I mean, that is just like to say, to me, that is like to say cancer is all kinds of cancer. But, I hope this doesn't trigger anybody out there who is a cancer patient or survivor, but lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, skin cancers are all various types of cancer. So we just don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to treating cancer. My opinion is that we should not have a one-size-fits-all approach to treating behavioral health, but yet that seems to be where we are headed. So I hope that you agree with the premise I just spelled out, but if you do, how do you combat that in the community? That notion.
That's a good question. First, I'd like to go back to Steve's point about
95
corridor. I meant to say that in the last one, but I got going on my story. I apologize. But from the 95 corridor from Florida to New York and back down, and we're passing straight through it, and also any areas with an international airport. But saying that piece of the international airport, I really want to emphasize it's in our own backyards. It's not, and it's often not someone who's being kidnapped and taken somewhere against her will, but versus the bonding that happens. It's called trauma bonding, where you build the relationship, or the trafficker builds the relationship with her, so she trusts him, and then when he tells her no one will want her after what's happened and that she chose it, that's what keeps her in her chains. To your question, Bill, about trauma is traumas are different, and they look different. And before I jump to like this, really what I want to talk about is the trifecta approach of addressing some economics that would help with some other things. I'll say that, like, the woman that we're supporting who was gang trafficked for 8 years, she has pretty intensive mental health needs. It's like so we're now working with the FBI to support her, and and they says like domestic violence on steroids before breaking those chains. And think about like how many times someone tries to get out of a domestic violence relationship. And this is not, and so it's on steroids, but of course her mental health needs are going to look different, being locked in a room a lot of times for 8 years with men just coming in and out. That's a different kind of response. Segueing from that, 100% of the world has experienced trauma at this point. Think about it, from even just the global pandemic, war, when a parent or an adult goes to war and they come back and they have a family, and this is not going to be at 100% rate, but like there's the attachment and the ability to readjust back to your everyday life, and then being able to connect to your kids. And attachment also impacts trauma. And so like, and if you in a city like Baltimore City, where either it's happening on your street or someone in your family's been killed, or there's violence in your home, or that you're afraid to send your kids out to the playground because there are needles on the playground, that is trauma. First-hand trauma, secondary trauma. And we need to be, and so when I hear elected leaders talking about trauma as talking points, that has real life impact on people who are experiencing trauma. And here's the kicker, is that especially for females, bipolar and borderline personality disorder mimic trauma. And so it's like we need to be asking questions about what's happening, not why they behave like they do, to find out what the actual approach is to supporting them. I had, because one of my mentors had said to me, Natasha, because I'm so vocal around the sexual exploitation matter, she said, you really need to put something together more than just the argument of why it shouldn't be. And that requires more than a talking point, but I called it the trifecta approach. And it's economic empowerment, which is actually not giving money to communities, but helping communities invest the money having certain businesses invest. Because, by the way, the largest growing number of entrepreneurs in our country are women, specifically Black and Hispanic women. So so a lot of the policies that we hear around sexual exploitation are angled at Black women, like, oh, so they don't get criminalized. No, let's empower the community so that they have more economic opportunities, so that she can go start some large corporation that employs more women and gives more jobs and careers, so that they can have a wage that they can support themselves and a family should they choose. The second part is trauma mitigation, and that's talking about trauma at every level, and not even talking about, but having elementary school teachers trained in identifying certain behaviors that are behavior problems. Behavior problems, we all know that term, fight, flight, or freeze, right? Mm-hmm. That is where the behavior problems come out of. But we're not seeing it. We don't have those words. We're just like, oh, they ran away or whatever it is. Well, that's the flight. Let's figure out what's happening. Why is she running away? And also, and then there are certain approaches to mitigating trauma for school teachers that we could be implementing. And the next part would be talking about sex, but that's off the conversation of trauma, more back onto the conversation of sexual exploitation. But the reason for talking about sex is, if we don't want to talk about the reproductive system, the penis and the vagina and how you have babies, why are we even going to talk about what happens when we close that door and she's sold for sex?
Steve, I know we're about 2/3 of the way through this podcast, and I feel like I've been hogging, so I'm going to shut my mouth, Steve, and ask the nice guests some questions.
Well, thank you, Bill. No, Bill, I've just enjoyed listening to the conversation. So, Natasha, I'm gonna tie your nonprofit world to your political world and talk about a couple of things that are going on in the world of politics that may or may not be affecting, what you do at HER. And the first one, you've talked a lot about addiction and recovery and things of that nature. So, I want to talk about the legislation that is out there in Annapolis to put on the ballot a constitutional amendment that would basically legalize recreational use of marijuana. I believe it was Delegate Clippinger that proposed that. And if it goes through, it's going to be on the ballot in November to legalize cannabis for recreational use. We had a really good conversation with candidate for office, Richard Deshay Elliott, who talked about some of the other things that could have been done that are missing. He felt like it didn't need to go to a constitutional amendment initiative. But I guess my question is, because you deal with substance abuse and maybe it's beyond cannabis, how do you feel about that legislation, about decriminalization in general, and how that would help and support the work that you do?
Steve, I'm going to try to delicately walk through this one, and it's not it's not. We at HER work within power structures. Now I push against power structures and I go find new ones to work within to help create more avenues of opportunity for the women we serve. And so I'm gonna try and say this. I am not a proponent for the legalization for recreational use. And I want to give you reason, not because I want anybody arrested. It's the brain is developing until you're 25. And so when you add a substance on top of it, not saying that it doesn't happen anyway, because that's usually the argument I get. It's happening anyway. I'm just making a factual a scientific fact. The brain is developing until you're 25. And if you add a substance like that, it impacts the brain's development. Second, and more to that economic part, unless it's decriminalized nationally, it disproportionately impacts those I serve, who are by and large, the 99% of the women I serve are Black or African-American identifying. And the reason I say this, especially like we've seen this with those who are definitely in the 18 to 25, in Baltimore, sometimes we veer outside that age range. It's because they can't get the first job when they have and a lot of entry-level jobs require drug tests. And if you can't pass a drug test because that entry-level job is required and you don't get that skill to be able to have the first job in the formal economy, that often keeps you out of the ability to make money and get a career. And I went to, after I graduated college, served in AmeriCorps, I went and worked on Capitol Hill for United States senators, starting with Harry Reid, and then Ben Nelson, Nebraska, and Brian Schatz of Hawaii. And the reason I point this out is I wasn't drug tested on the Hill. I was drug tested at Safeway, my first recovery job. And so I don't know when we do our employment workshops with her, I often talk about, man, I hated working at Safeway. But if I hadn't learned how to balance my till at night, I may not have been able to have that job managing multi-million-dollar budgets for United States senators. And so that first job often leads to the next one. And if you're not able to get it because you can't pass a drug test, we're keeping a lot of people out of the workforce. And so
hey, Bill, I think we have a little bit of a break here. Are you noticing that?
Yes, sorry. Natasha just froze.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Hopefully we get her back here because she was. I was really.
This happened to us when we interviewed Bill Henry. I mean, oh, there you go. Natasha, you froze for about 15, 20 seconds.
Are we back?
Yes.
Okay, I heard you guys saying I was frozen. I apologize, but I was not.
Okay, no worries.
No, please continue.
Where did we? I'm sure I was on a good monologue. That's why I'm asking. I'm just kidding.
You just talked about working at Safeway, and that if you hadn't have done that job, then you couldn't have been able to balance a ledger for the budgets for the offices that you managed and so forth.
So if I got that far, I was just trying to say that I'm not sure how we get to a national policy around it so that nationwide businesses like chains like grocery stores aren't able to have the drug testing. But think about from a liability standpoint. Good luck with that. But what I was trying to say is I don't know if through these state movements do the current constituents take the hit, hoping that over the time to come, at a national level, something will change But then again, think about how many people we lose in the workforce while we're having that fight.
Yeah. No, thank you for that answer. And it is an interesting debate. I have always been, just full disclosure, I've always been an advocate for use of cannabis for medicinal purposes. I thought that was a no-brainer. I still do. I myself have always been a bit torn on recreational use. I don't know that I have taken a full-blown side. I've kind of went back and forth because there is a lot to consider. And the private industry piece of it, the employment piece of it, is one I don't know that a lot of people, I know I've not thought about it in those terms, that you could decriminalize it even in the state of Maryland, but you could have an employer that doesn't have to go along with that and can still drug test, and that can still affect one's chances of getting a job. So that's an angle that I can say I've not thought about. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective, because it's one that I think more people need to consider as we go along this process with what's going on in Annapolis.
Yes, I'll say that I have a lot of government funding at HER, which requires drug testing. So I can't hire individuals who can't pass a drug test. And it's because those are stipulations on us, but also we often transport those we serve in our vehicles. And so I also can't have someone get in a car accident and then not pass a drug test. And then where's that liability fall if she's hurt? Or the passenger. I'll also say that my sister called me early 2021 or maybe 2020, I can't recall. And she was really nervous to tell me that Oklahoma legalized the growing of cannabis. She's really nervous to tell me, knowing how much I, as a person, do not like marijuana. And she told me, and I listened. And when she was done talking through it, I was like, listen, not everybody's an addict. I am. Not everybody is as involved in the lives of the the lives of individuals who are often marginalized. I am. And that's what I have to think about. But I'm also very much a proponent of small business and women-owned business. And I understand that there are multiple sides to every argument. I just have to think about the side for the side of those I'm trying to support, to finding their own economic power and for their freedom.
No, thank you for that answer. Want to ask another question, and I apologize if it's a little bit out of the age range, because I know your area is primarily women 18 to 25, but because of your expertise in the area of dealing with survivors and victims, I just wanted to ask this question to get your perspective on it. And it, again, kind of brings both of your worlds together, and also, brings Bill's and my worlds together, because it involves a delegate from our home district, District 13, one Vanessa Atterbury, who I think since day one has been pushing, to pass legislation that deals with child marriage. She has made that like a signature issue of hers. I can't remember where it left off. I know she had been pushing. I don't think she ever got her legislation through, but she's really worked hard on just changing that age of consent to where you didn't have, young women as young as 10, 11, getting married, and in situations where, to be honest, they should not be in, and it really sets them up to become some of the women that you ultimately will deal with. So I just want to get your take on the whole issue of child marriage, and like I said, maybe some of the women who end up coming to her at age 18, maybe that was the start of what was a traumatic experience for them.
Yes, I'm sorry. That one kind of caught me off guard. I'll say that I'm going to take this back to the sexual exploitation realm. You can't consent to sex until you're 18 years old. So therefore, any minors who are engaging in the selling of sex with or without a trafficker, by legal definition, is sex trafficking. And so to know that we're still talking about whether or not, the news, I've seen it move away from this, but when I would see the title on news, like child prostitute, nope, child prostitute does not exist. It is sex trafficking. And so I wrote it down, child marriage doesn't, I hope whatever she's pushing is to make sure that doesn't happen any further. It's just really like, the longer at her, we talk a lot about sex in terms of prevention of STDs, STIs, and unplanned pregnancies. And the reason is as it relates to pregnancy is the more time she has to achieve her goals, the more economic independence she has to having a life that she wants. And again, the brain is developing until you're 25 years old. So someone who's being married off at 10, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with this one. 10-year-olds, they play with toys. Why are we talking about marriage? I think that's where I'm getting caught up.
If I can interject, in point of fact, the age of consent by which a person can get married in Maryland is currently 16. And what Delegate Atterbury has wanted to do is to move that up to 18.
Right,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, 10 was an example. I mean, there were some archaic laws that may still be on the books in other states that take it that low. But yes, Bill, you're right. She wanted to take it from, from your mid-teens out to your late teens at age 18. So thank you, Bill, for the clarification on that.
Yes, and I believe it's probably in other places in our country. I just wasn't. I was like, man, that was catching me. But regardless, like, think about you can't join the military until you're 18. You can't. You're not a legal adult until you're 18. Why we're allowing for the under 18. But then again, it could be when, in certain situations, if she gets pregnant or whatever those factors are. But again, it goes back to why aren't we talking about some of these opportunities so that she can have a life she wants long term, not to take her power away from her at 16. But when I tell the women at her, when they want to talk about certain things on social media, what they want on the internet at 18 may not be what they want on the internet at 36. And so what's at 16, married to a person who may be older, may not be what they want in even 2 years. I feel like I did not give that one, I'm just kind of blown away by the question. I'm sorry.
I know, and my apologies, but again, just because of your expertise, and I just see, I can almost see the connection that if you've got young women who are getting married at, Maryland is better than most, even though I think 16 needs to be dealt with, but even that's better than some states out there. But, I just wanted to ask it because I could see some of those young women in situations where when they get in that 18 to 25 age, they're talking to somebody like yourself because they realize the situation that they've either gotten themselves into or in a lot of cases forced into because of unplanned pregnancies, et cetera. So
that, I think, again, if it's pregnancy related, it's like talking about sex and prevention, but it's also, I know someone who got pregnant at 16 and the man she was with was 27 and she married him. And it was it was a horrific marriage for her. And so if that answers your question, it's why there's a significant power dynamic when she can't make other legal choices because she probably would need a legal guardian. And when you get married, it's my understanding, because I haven't been married, that next legal entity would be your spouse.
So Natasha, we have about 5 minutes left in the podcast, and it's clear from our conversation, which has been really useful and helpful. So sometimes, we in Howard County and elsewhere where, we'd like to think of ourselves as having a certain level of privilege, we get very happy with ourselves to do certain things for the underprivileged. Creating entrepreneurship groups for girls and young women, girls who code, women who code, that sort of thing, STEM and STEAM accessibility for girls and women and people of color. And all of those are very important. And I think we can all agree that they are. But I do believe that sometimes we have a little bit of a blind spot in that those items are a little bit higher up on that old hierarchy of needs, and that, before you can even get there, there are people who just basically need the skills to survive. and that's where you fit in. And where what you and your organization and what her Resiliency Center does is so incredibly useful and a benefit to Maryland and to DC. I know that the state legislature has about a month going on left in it, and I know that you're not a lobbyist per se, but are there any legislative initiatives or anything going on either on the state or possibly on a local level that people who might be watching or listening might want to take an interest to that you're aware of?
I would, because I was talking to some unelected leader in Prince George's, not as in any kind of lobbying capacity, but versus an advocacy capacity, because we need, in social services, we respond to what the government dictates as the needs. When you can have advocacy involved, you can help influence what we're actually seeing in social services so that the funding can respond to the actual need. In this conversation, from a COVID standpoint, we've experienced, so a lot of the women we serve in DC have started to move into Prince George's County because they can't afford to live in DC. There are a number of women we serve who are behind on their rent. And one of them, I was blown away to find out $23,000 behind on her rent because the company, the company of her building did not collect rent for those 2 years. But I also know that those landlords could have filed for COVID relief for their tenants and didn't. And so now she is stressing about carrying that debt on her credit for the next several years. And so in talking to the individual in Prince George's, it's like, how could we have some of that relieved from this time of a pandemic? Now I'll say at her Resiliency Center, we're supporting that woman on the individual level to getting to different housing and back into employment now that the world is reopening. And she's also just a few credits shy of graduating with her college degree. But now she's going to have that debt hanging around her shoulder. So in talking about that is like, could something have been done in Annapolis to support more of those examples? And then at the local level, we're just, especially here in Baltimore, is looking at the sexual exploitation of women, and like trying to really work to identify and help the general public to understand the difference between sex work and sex trafficking and even elected leadership, because oftentimes those who get elected to office, getting elected to office requires money. And and to be able to be around money, you often don't have to make survival decisions that stem and that could lead to places that the vulnerability of being sexually exploited in one capacity or another. And so helping them also understand the key differences and what the next choice could be should she want a different life.
I think what I'm also hearing you say before we wrap up is that, for those of us who might have an interest in these sorts of issues, as I do, is to not just, look at buzzwords of what people are offering who are running for office. In Howard County here, people like to say, we're going to end homelessness and, take on addiction and make everybody mentally healthy. And these sorts of absolutes, I know I find personally skeptical. And I think what I'm hearing you urging people to do is to be critical of folks claiming to help the community.
All I know is that there are no quick solutions to systemic issues, and anybody who's offering quick solutions, we should be running from, because it's dangerous, because it won't happen fast. And that we need leadership who's willing to sit in the uncomfortability of the vulnerability, knowing that it's going to take time to create real change that's sustainable, and that the general public to actually, like you said, Bill, to do research to find out is this probable? Is this possible? But also encouraging our leaders to know that we understand it's going to take time.
Well, that would be my question here, Natasha, is, we seem to live, my late mother used to call it the microwave world. It might even be quicker than that now with social media, where, so many people want things right away. And I think there is my own soapbox moment. There seems to be a lack of understanding or willingness, you can debate which word is appropriate, of people to accept the fact that things take time. And when you look at things like sex trafficking, when you look at things like addiction, when you look at some of the things that, the Her Resiliency Center, gets into dealing with some of these women, you're right, there are no quick answers, but I think we too often are in a world where people want a quick answer. And if you don't have that answer in 6 months, it's, well, you have failed. How do you confront?
We're going to offering quick solutions is going to lead to that failure, because they're not possible to implement in 6 months. And so we're not even setting realistic expectations for ourselves, like for a leader, like a candidate who's proposing something quick. You're not even giving yourself a realistic opportunity to win and actually implement, because things take time. And, and I worked, like I said, in the United States Senate, where everything, I've seen it takes time to actually implement. And by the way, anything that comes with money in any jurisdiction, money is wonderful. I'm not going to lie, but it creates problems. And it's because you have to build that infrastructure. You have to know how to use it. You have to be able to get the system set up, and that alone can take months. And so I think just being aware that quick solutions don't exist, and anybody offering them, we should be afraid of.
Well, I appreciate that. I could not agree more. And Bill, I'll let you wrap this thing up, because I want to give Natasha an opportunity to any message she wants to get out to those listening, watching, so I'm going to turn it over to you to let you tee that up.
Well, I was going to let you hit first, sir. Natasha, for anybody who wants to support the work of Her Resiliency Center, how can they do that?
In the jurisdiction, in the areas where we are located, find us at herresiliencycenter.org. You'll shoot us an email at info@herresiliency.org. In areas where we may not be located, I would encourage you to find organizations that support some of these issues, and get involved. I'd also encourage opportunities to build empathy in the community, so that we can actually treat each other like human beings, and not like criminals or less than, but actually like people that we all deserve to be.
Well, thank you, Natasha. It is International Women's Month, and there are lots of women who are doing fantastic things in the community, but I'm not just saying this because I've known you for a little bit. I'm saying this because of the work that you do, but you truly are a treasure in this region. And the work you do is so important. And I'm very happy and proud to have supported that in the past, and looking forward to continuing to do that, and to continue to learn of many great things to come. And it will not be 2 years before you're back on this podcast again, if you want to be.
Please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Bill.
All right.
Yeah,
well,
and I'm sorry, but let me just add my thanks as well for the conversation, which was amazing. And also, a lot of times you hear, thank you for your service to our military men and women, and rightfully so. You hear, thank you for your service to our firefighters and police officers and EMTs. But there's a saying, some heroes don't wear capes. Well, some heroes don't wear uniforms, and people like yourself who are on the ground, neighborhood by neighborhood, you're in that camp as well. So thank you for your service.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I think you guys for both having me on. It's really an opportunity that I did not want to miss, because part of my job is to help inform on what's happening and what we see on the ground, so that we can help change it at all levels. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Natasha. Steve, as always, thank you. Next weekend, we are going to have an episode based around the ever elongating Maryland election cycle, and also a look at our hometown district, Steve and my beloved District 13, because it just has to happen. And, you know, at this rate, Steve, the 2022 election is not going to finish until 2023. It's going to be just like the Olympics. We will talk about that more next weekend. Until then, I hope you all have a terrific week. Remember to like and subscribe to us on YouTube, because YouTube subscribers are the way to a better life. And for Steve Hunt, I'm Bill Woodcock, and you have been watching or listening to another edition of Forward Maryland. Take care, everybody.